Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Coder Career podcast with me, your host, Cameron Blackwood. If you aren't familiar already, I'm an ex-technical recruiter who is now retrained as a software engineer, and this podcast is a place for me to give advice from both sides of the table and interview some really awesome and interesting guests who have a ton of insight to help you, again, from both sides of the table. My guest today is from the technical side of the table. He is a highly experienced CTO, co-founder, software engineer who's worked at startups, large corporates, some of the biggest tech companies in London. So he's got a ton of insight and is a really interesting guy. His name is Andrew Easter. Thanks so much for coming on today, Andrew.
Thank you very much for having me, Cameron. Nice to be here.
Great to have you. So basically, the way I like to start things is just to run through some quickfire questions. But before we do that, do you want to give like a very sort of brief rundown on who you are and what the listeners can expect of today?
So yeah, I'm Andrew. I'm the CTO at Claimer. I've had a long career in technology, nearly 20 years now, and it's brought me to this day to be in this kind of CTO position, which has been a baptism of fire in some regards, but it's a very rewarding experience. Claimer is we exist to reduce friction for companies in the United Kingdom to benefit from government incentives, and we're on that is our long-term mission is to spread our wings even further than the UK, but our focus right now is on R&D tax credits.
Very nice. So you're helping other innovative businesses smooth their way to government funding, which is a really exciting vision. And you're helping out other startups whilst also being a startup yourself, which is something people absolutely love to see.
Yeah. It's the funny thing is people might say you're just like a tax business or whatever, right? But you phrased it at least as well as I could. Actually, we see ourselves as a way for companies to secure funding, in a different way to how different ways to how they may think they can receive funding. So yes, it's a very rewarding thing to do.
Sounds fantastic, and any sort of startup CEO should definitely listen up to the technical details of how Claimer works as well for later in this podcast. So on to the quickfire questions now, Andrew, and you already alluded to the amount of experience you have in this industry, so this should be a good answer. What was your first ever computer?
My first computer was a BBC Micro.
As in British Broadcasting Corporation?
To be honest with you, I don't even know whether there is a correlation between those two things. But yeah, this is like seriously old school, right? So it must be 35 years ago or something. So
interesting. And so I guess no graphical interface there. That's all command line stuff.
Yeah, there was very, very basic graphics, but yeah. I mean, I was doing. I actually kind of learned coding on that, but that's probably something we'll come on to later in this discussion, I imagine.
That's pretty cool. Then. So you said 35 years. So I guess we're talking 80s, early 90s there.
Yeah. So this was hot stuff in the 80s. This was when you were still like loading up basic games via tape rather than disc. So.
Yeah, I saw that on a. There's that guy on YouTube, Angry Video Game Nerd. One of his episodes from a few years ago, he played some games on cassette tape, and I couldn't believe it. I grew up in the sort of PS2 era, and I never even considered. I guess obviously it's data, right? So you can store it in whatever format you want. It's just a weird thing to think about.
Yeah, I mean this was like it was kind of really frustrating at times because you would take I don't know how many minutes like. Double-digit minutes just to actually load the game up, right? And if anything went wrong during that process, you'd have to start again, right? So, yeah, this was kind of like early days gaming.
Makes you thankful for a solid-state drive, doesn't it? These days,
it does.
What about your favorite tech city? Because I know I think you've mentioned to me before that you traveled a bit for work.
Yeah, I think I'm obliged to say Croydon Tech City for this.
Very nice.
Yeah, I grew up in Croydon, and Claimer's office. Although we're kind of a hybrid company these days, especially post pandemic, our office is in Croydon. Our founder Adam. He grew up in Croydon, so the kind of the soul of Claimer very much is Croydon. A few years ago. unfortunately, Croydon Tech City doesn't exist anymore as a concept, but it was something that it was a grassroots organisation that existed in Croydon for a few years, and for various reasons it no longer exists. But actually, this was where I met Adam, the founder of Claimer, about 7 years ago, and that's led to us then working together now. So I have to say it's my favourite because it's got a nice backstory for Claimer.
Very nice. And as a Croydon native, can you settle the long-time debate, is Croydon part of London?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, because I've had some people who say that it should be its own independent city. I mean, not on this podcast. This isn't like a Croydon-specific podcast, but I just mean in general people, because I lived in South London for a long time, and a lot of people have told me Croydon should be its own like independent city. But interesting.
It's big enough to be one.
Yeah, it is huge, isn't it? But yeah, so for those who aren't familiar, those from outside the UK, maybe Croydon is a big district in the south of London, but not its own city. You've heard it from a Croydon native himself. So, in terms of when you are working in your favourite tech city, are you more of a music or a podcast man?
Music, I would say. Yeah, I find music is just a little bit more less distracting. I think if I'm listening to podcasts when I'm working, I probably will be more distracted. It's more just a little bit more kind of verbal noise. So I'm more likely to reach for music.
What kind of stuff do you like to listen to when you're coding? What's like your focus playlist? What kind of genre?
I think it would vary depending on what I'm working on. Sometimes if I'm working on something particularly complicated, I probably wouldn't listen to anything at all. Or if I did, it might be like classical music without any vocals. But for all other times, a bit of rock music, country music, a bit of folk music, that type of thing.
Nice. Yeah, I like a bit of rock music while coding as well. That and electronic, it's a good way. I'm trying to get into listening to classical music when I code more, because I've heard about the effects on the brain of how it makes you focus, and also feel pretty classy when I do it, which is always nice. And what about like when you work? Would you consider yourself more of like an early bird or a night owl? What sort of time of day do you get your best work done?
I've always been, I'd say, more of a night owl. I mean, and part to be honest, that's now become somewhat enforced in my life because I'm a parent of 2 children, and in order to ensure that I can kind of meet all my life and work obligations, I'm almost naturally forced to spend time working in the evening. So, fortunately, that kind of suits me anyway. So I would say I'm a night owl naturally and also forcefully as well.
Very nice. And that's the great thing about flexible working. That's what I love about this career is the fact that, it can fit around your responsibilities and everything like that. I mean, I say that as someone with literally like 0 life responsibilities, but I imagine if I had more life responsibilities, it would be, I'd really appreciate my flexible working even more.
It does help a lot, right? I mean, someone said to me once, I attended a management training and the facilitator actually said there's no such thing as work-life balance. There's just life. And I think, so really all we're doing, right, is just trying to find ways to satisfy all the obligations and, that we have in our lives. And so flexibility in all parts of our lives comes together to allow us to manage our lives in the best ways that we can.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a really good way of summing it up. And I mean, we're talking about sort of tech as an industry. Was it something you always wanted to go into when you were a kid? Did you have like a dream job that wasn't a software engineer, or was it since day dot you knew this is what you wanted to do?
I wanted to be an airline pilot.
Oh, nice.
Actually, I weirdly though, I actually through a period of time I was scared of flying, which seems a bit absurd, frankly. That I was an airline pilot. A wannabe airline pilot who was frightened of flying. But I was always fascinated with it, and it always felt like such a different and kind of unique vocation. But that didn't happen. So I also I also did really like coding when I was young, right? So I had a backup, and I guess you could say I've ended up in the backup.
Very, very nice. Yeah, I cycled through quite a few different dream jobs when I was a kid, but one of them was airline pilot. But I must have been about 7 when I found out I was colorblind, and it was a crushing blow in the opticians because that was literally in that probably 6 months of my life where I'd cycled into wanting to be an airline pilot, and I was extremely upset because you can't be an airline pilot and be colorblind, which is probably a good thing for like radar purposes and that kind of thing. To be
Yeah,
honest, seeing as
that's
I
a
can't.
shame. That's a shame. That's a shame.
Yeah, I can't see about 3 or 4 different colours, so it's probably a good thing that I'm not in the skies right now for for would-be passengers of planes. um, but yeah, so we talked about how you're into coding from a young age. How did that journey start? Was it the sort of thing where your parents encouraged you to get into it, or did you discover it yourself? And then I guess that ends up going to you went down the road of becoming an engineer as a full-time job.
My memory of this is that my dad used to write code that he read out of a magazine. He used to type the code into the BBC Micro machine,
Mm.
and then and typically what these things were like. Well, he was writing the code for me, I guess, because these things in these magazines, they literally, like, in the magazine, they'd have all the code listing, and you'd manually type it out yourself, and it would be typically things like just multiplication tests and stuff. So he would write some code that would just prompt an answer to a multiplication problem, right? And so I would then be able to use that, run the program myself and actually interact with it that my dad had written. And so I kind of then got interested in how that worked, and then started kind of writing my own programs, rather than reciting them from a magazine. I then actually thought, well, I can write my own things here. So I then, for example, got into writing like the sort of text adventure games and stuff like that, where it prompts you. It says, "Oh, you're currently standing in a castle or something, and do you want to go north, south, east, west, or whatever, and stuff like that." So that was kind of how it all kind of started, just getting used to writing simple kind of text-based games and stuff like that.
That's really cool, and that's such an exciting way to get into it, and that's something I've always wanted to do. I literally have just never thought to actually put it into practice. So I'd definitely give that a go in JavaScript at some point, because it's definitely cheaper with modern toolings out there. So that is really cool, and that magazine, I absolutely love that, writing out code from a magazine. When I hear stories like that, I'm so thankful I didn't write my first line of code until 2018, because it sounds like it was much harder.
It seems ridiculous now to actually say that, but it seemed completely normal at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I suppose it's the best medium at the time, right? And, people had to do that so we could get to the point where we're at now. We have this amazing infrastructure. And that's what I love about the technology community, is the amount of open source tooling we have out there, and the fact that people are always striving to create a great ecosystem, and that people who are listening to this, who are learning to code, have access to so many resources with just an internet connection. It's a fantastic thing. It's something pretty unique to our industry, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And would you say the industry's evolved a lot throughout your career in the time you've been involved, or is it something it has the mentality always stayed roughly the same, would you say?
Well, certainly in my entire lifetime of writing code, it's quite clear it's changed quite a lot.
Yeah.
Because we're certainly not writing stuff out of magazines anymore. But yes, my career started back in post university back in 2003. And obviously, a lot has evolved in that time. If you just see from, if you consider like 2003, this is pretty much pre-social media, right? So there was no Twitter, potentially no Facebook at that point. I can't
Facebook's
remember
2004.
exactly.
So yeah, it would have been pre-Facebook. Yeah.
So I was at work when people weren't just browsing Facebook. So that's that says a lot. But yeah, in terms of like the industry evolving, like obviously, I would say one big thing is just how much more of a community it feels now. because obviously the bigger the industry has grown and the more people who are working in it, the more that's kind of brought people together in a community. And obviously the open source software scene is now exploded compared to what it was when I started, and so now as a community, like we're all solving problems together and sharing solutions to those problems, and what it means now, I guess, is that so many common problems that in the past you would sort of end up having to just solve yourself. We were reinventing the wheel, I guess, a lot, because there was never really a particularly useful medium or a viable medium to actually share the wheels we were creating, right? So now we're in a position where with the rise of open source and things like the platforms like GitHub to be able to share these things, and public package libraries and stuff, like now all of these useful creations, we are able to share them, and ultimately that speeds us all up at how quick we can innovate and build things.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's an unbelievable ecosystem. And like whatever you want to do, there's like a library out there for it, and there's always opportunities to contribute to open source. And I discussed this a few weeks ago on my guests, and we were saying that anyone that's listening that is a beginner, you can still contribute to open source. Like, yeah, no, you might not be working on React's core code, but what you can do is stuff like even just documentation, like translation, clearing things up, finding errors. Like my first open source contribution was I literally found something spelt wrong in some code on some documentation. So if you ran the example, it returned undefined, when it was actually just because I think it was like not even a spelling error, it was like a casing error or something like that. And I submitted it to the guy who was like running the whole project, and I was really scared to do it, and I remember refusing to do it as a PR at first, and saying like, just fix it yourself, just so you know that this is the issue and this is a solution. You can do it yourself. I'm scared of breaking the whole code base. And he found it very funny, and luckily he gave me a lot of time, and he was just like, it's fine, calm down, I'll show you how to open the PR, which is nice. So that's the story of my first contribution to open source. But yeah, it's really awesome, and you can really just get stuck in, like from 0 years experience, like your help is always required, and it's open source is what makes the technology world go round.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's just that's nice about it, right, is not just the fact that this stuff is available, but it creates a very just like positive feeling about being part of that ecosystem, because I always sort of feel like, I don't know, like really, I guess, dumbfounded by the generosity of people in the community to be doing this, to be making these contributions, right? Because it just makes you feel part of something special, which is another great part of being part of this industry, because you can feel part of that, and it gives you like a nice warm sense of humanity in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And there are some absolutely legendary developers, trying to think top of my head, Evan Yu, the creator of Vue.js, is literally, it's just his full-time job, and he just works on it. And he doesn't really. He asked for a bit of contribution from some companies just to help him with his living costs, but in another industry, he would just sell that as like proprietary software and become a multi-millionaire, but he doesn't. And I think it's very admirable that people will do that with their talents, and it says a lot about this industry. And the amount of open source learning platforms there are out there is too many for me to list. I'll put some in the description, of course, for people that are curious. But it's unbelievable the amount of work people put into helping people out, and it's really a great advertisement for the industry. The next question I had actually was more about the last few years of your career. Most recently, you've gone from working in larger organizations to being more gravitated towards startups. What was the motivation for you to make that switch? Because a lot of people that are listening are trying to decide right now, should I work for a small company or a large company for my first couple of roles? What's your perspective both on yourself making the switch, albeit as a more senior member of staff, and what would you advise to other people who are considering weighing up the two options?
Yeah, so what I would say is it comes down to, I think there is obviously an individual element to this. What works for some people obviously won't work for other people. But I mean, in my case, I kind of had it in my on my agenda to put myself in environments earlier in my career where I could learn as quickly as possible. And I felt that the types of company that would be able to support me on my learning journey would be larger organizations. And this is something that actually is quite relevant. Now I'm in the startup world, is this recognition of, especially when you're in a sort of leadership role and you're hiring, is you're very conscious of not wanting to hold people's careers back. And especially in a startup, it's very difficult for us to, for example, to consider hiring very junior developers, for example, because we don't, not because we're saying, they're not capable of contributing or whatever, but more that we're just saying, we want to be in a position where if we're hiring people, that we can support them to achieve their goals. And as a startup, are we able to really say that we could, that at this stage we can help juniors to achieve their learning goals? The answer is probably no. And so certainly I sort of felt I recognized that maybe at an earlier stage. And so it was much more natural for me to kind of seek larger organizations where they would have the capacity to be able to support people on that learning journey. So, but as I progressed through my journey, some of the frustrations, I guess, of working for a larger organization in terms of the speed of decision making, the autonomy and empowerment that you can have just to get stuff done, and you're not kind of designing by committee the whole time. That became, those types of constraints, at least I see them as constraints, drove me towards the startup world, where I could take all the experience that I've picked up and all the valuable learning I've been lucky to build throughout my career, and actually apply that in an environment where, a fast-moving environment where we can make decisions quickly and iterate fast on innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very interesting perspective, and I think for people who are learning, it's good to have the structure there. But as well, I think the challenges you get as part of a startup are really unique, and you can still sometimes face those in a larger organization. But I mean, I've worked in a mix of both in technical and non-technical roles, and I honestly I enjoy both. And I think most people, I'm not. I think you'd probably agree with me on this. Most people, it's a good experience to try working at both at some point in their career, because you get a different perspective on things. And often after you've done one, you want to do the other. A lot of the time. I mean, I'm saying that as someone who's kind of at the mid-level point in my career. I'm not a senior, but that's definitely the way I found things. And I guess while we're talking seniority, you've obviously risen the ranks yourself up to CTO. What's been your experience? What lessons have you learned from taking on that CTO role in the last few years from being a developer?
Well, yeah, it's a really good question. I saw something on LinkedIn a couple of months ago. Someone had written a comment on there just saying, bigging up CTOs because they're the people who create a facade of structure and normality and everything's great, but actually behind the covers everything's total chaos, right? So it's not, it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but the point is that you have to, as a startup CTO, you have to be willing to accept and embrace a degree of chaos in how things play out, at that early stage, because you're always balancing like the kind of the future sustainability of what you're building versus just, getting product market fit, and being commercially sustainable. And obviously the quicker you can find product market fit, the better. And therefore finding product market fit requires fast iteration. And sometimes that means making certain compromises along the way. You might not be able to put together the most ideal solution to every problem that you face. So it's about managing chaos to some extent. And I think that's the difference between where I was before and what I'm doing now is actually not so much that, there's not so much that there isn't chaos elsewhere, but it's just suddenly when you're the person who's actually responsible for making sure that chaos doesn't descend into just, oblivion, basically, is certainly an interesting challenge.
Yeah, certainly sounds it, and I think there's a lot of plates to keep spinning and expectations to keep. So it's a tough role, but a rewarding one. I can certainly imagine. And if you could time travel back to your first day as a CTO, what do you think you'd say to yourself now having kind of lived the life? What advice would you give?
Yeah, I guess I would just tell myself, don't beat yourself up when things aren't all great, and be willing to embrace uncertainty and a little bit of chaos here and there. I think that's because I think the problem is if you go in with the wrong expectations, then you're going to find yourself more stressed and kind of questioning whether you're creating value and whether you're essentially whether you're just a massive imposter in what you're doing, right? So I think I see quite a lot of imposter syndrome generally amongst a lot of people in the technology industry, and I think to some extent that is just down to the expectations that maybe we naturally set for ourselves. We set the bar quite high, and so we judge ourselves quite critically. And so, yeah, I think I would just tell myself to chill out a little bit and not get paranoid about things not being perfect.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely, and that's brilliant advice for life as well, really, and it's something I'm trying to work on myself. And I'm so glad you brought up imposter syndrome as well, because from what I've heard, that affects every developer, no matter where they are on their journey. At some point, you're going to get some imposter syndrome, and if you find that happening to yourself and you're looking at everyone else, and if you're listening now and maybe you're in your first dev job or you're still learning to code and you're seeing people around thinking, oh wow, they're so smart and all the rest of it, everyone gets it, and you're really capable, and everyone can be a good engineer. It's a confidence thing, and a bit of imposter syndrome is in a weird way a healthy thing, because it shows that you have the ambition to improve yourself. But don't let it rule you, is the advice I'd give to anyone suffering from imposter syndrome. Like you can do it, and there's enough resources for you to be able to solve your own problems, and you'd be amazed at the code you can write. And stuff for like a good confidence booster, I find with imposter syndrome is go back and look at your old code from a year or two ago, or even a shorter time frame than that if you're learning his code right now. One of my previous guests, Sam, who I worked with when I was a recruiter, was actually joking with me about this, because I sent him my first ever website, and I was so embarrassed when Sam was saying about the website because the code is so janky, but I was so proud of it when I wrote that. It was my first project and I'd been coding for about a month. Nowadays, I would be totally embarrassed by it because I've looked at conventions, they're all over the place. I haven't got a clue what's going on. The CSS is like some kind of like early 2000s MySpace disaster, but I was so proud of it at the time. But I look back on it now and know it's not very good, but like I had to do that to get to the point where I'm at now. And you've got to be able to walk before you can run. And that's really, I've gone off on a tangent here, but imposter syndrome, everyone gets it, and don't delude yourself into thinking that you're the only one that gets it, because it is so hard. And if you're listening and you're struggling with it, just keep going is what I'd say.
I think there's something I'd add to that would just be, it's really important to recognize that as human beings we often take for granted the skills that come naturally to us, and therefore you basically, it's very easy to underappreciate your own skills, because if there's something you can do and it's just it just comes naturally, then you don't actually consider that in your own mind or frame that in your own mind as a skill. And yet there's many other people who don't have that skill, who are probably looking at you and thinking, wow, they've got that skill. And I think that's part of the reason for imposter syndrome is maybe a human element of taking for granted what you're good at, and therefore not valuing yourself because you don't think that, you think because it's easy to you that therefore it's not valuable, and that's obviously not the reality at all.
Absolutely, and an example that popped into my head, and regular listeners to the podcast will know that Cam loves an analogy. But my analogy for this situation is it's like driving a car. Apologies to anyone that hasn't passed their driving test, but I was actually thinking this last night when I was driving home from Tesco. If anyone's curious, I was driving home from Tesco, and I was thinking it's really weird that like learning to drive was such a big deal, and I do it without thinking. Well, I don't totally do it without thinking, obviously, but
Well, I hope not. I hope.
yeah, yeah. The streets of Edinburgh are no longer safe, but the but a lot of it comes quite naturally to you, and you don't think about the little things. And when you're driving a car and you're learning, you just think about finding the biting point and all these tiny little things. And like coding, it's quite similar. And people that can't drive are sort of in awe of it. And certainly, I remember I was my first driving lesson. I was really scared, and nowadays it's kind of whatever. I wouldn't say I'm like completely callous to driving, obviously. But, I'm not sure about that analogy actually.
No, I think it is. I think it is a generally a pretty good one, Cam.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. You're being very kind. I'll leave that in the podcast. People can use a good laugh. Cool. And moving swiftly on, we're talking about imposter syndrome and generally themes of growth. We're talking a bit hypothetically here. Say you had a relative that was maybe between the ages of like 16 and 19, and they're curious about getting into software as a career. They maybe haven't really, like, they maybe written a bit of JavaScript or something, but they don't know that much about the industry. It's current year, obviously, 2021. What would you say to them right now? What would be your kind of top line advice for them?
What I would say, and this does actually come back to one of your, I think it's related to one of the previous things we were talking about. And again, I think there's an element of imposter syndrome. Well, it relates to imposter syndrome a little bit. Is I think the industry can seem very daunting because there is a heck of a lot that you could know, and I think there is a danger that people see that as this enormous barrier, and actually that maybe the tendency is from a behavioural perspective to therefore try to spread yourself very thinly in order to feel like you're able to have something useful to say about all these different things. Whereas I think in reality and what companies are looking for, would be someone who's kind of more niche skilled and can actually be productive in something more specific rather than being a generalist. It's okay to be, to be, to focus on a niche. And I think, and that, so I would say to someone like, don't get bogged down thinking that you need to learn everything. Focus on skilling up in something more specific. Because that's manageable, and it's just not manageable to try and be good in everything. And frankly, as you go through your career, that will always be a thing. You're never going to be able to do everything. And in some senses, I think maybe the community as a whole could do a better job of making people realize that is the reality. And for example, like, it is quite common to use the terminology these days, full stack developer. I sit on the side of the fence where I'm a bit skeptical of that term, just on the basis that I think if you're a full stack developer, it's almost impossible to be a full stack developer and not be a generalist in some regards, because you can't know everything, and therefore, yeah, I would say certainly entering the industry, it makes sense to focus on being able to provide value in a niche, and because I think that's the way you can be most valuable to a company that you would be joining.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And there's enough demand worldwide, wherever you're listening to this podcast, that your niche and your specialism will be catered for. And there are lots of different niches you can train in: front end, back end, DevOps. And I do agree with you, a full stack developer. I think there's no such thing as a true full stack developer, because someone will always bias towards one side. Like,
Yes.
I'm technically a full stack developer, but I'm literally like 85% front end, really. Like, yes, my title is software engineer, but I'm really more or less a front end developer. I know a bit of DevOps, and I can write Node.js, but it's one of those things where, I mean, I think you might have showed me this either tweet or LinkedIn post ages ago, where it was. It said, "Oh, so you want someone who can do React, Node, Kubernetes, Docker, C#. That's not a developer; that's an IT department." Which is it does come back.
I think I remember sharing that, but I think just to qualify my comment, I don't deny the existence of the full stack developer. But I think what's missing is, just by using that term, it doesn't actually, uncover what you've just said, which is the fact that there will still be a bias in there towards one or the other, or it's not even one or the other. It could be front end, back end. It could be infrastructure. So I think that's the point. Like, full stack developers do exist, and I would say that I can cover full stack myself, right? But it's certainly not like that I'm 100% competent in all of those things.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like it's the same with every professional. Like, if you're a marketing executive, like, you're probably going to have a specialism towards like content or pay-per-click advertising or something like that. You're probably going to have a strength. Doesn't mean you can't do everything, but you're probably just going to be better at one thing. So don't be afraid to exploit your niche. And also, as well, if you get really good at a niche, it's basic economics that you're probably actually going to have a higher salary as well. Because if you're really good at one niche skill, you're actually going to add more value to that company as well. So if you want to maximize your salary, which is obviously, who doesn't like money, right? It's quite a good strategy on a macro level. Obviously, I can't give exact data to back that up, but that's in theory how it should work.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly reasonable. And I just think it's a case of, certainly as a junior person entering the industry, you don't allow like the term full stack developer to distract you into thinking that you've got to be able to be competent in all of this stuff, because it's a big learning journey. And in terms of how the industry evolves, software engineering is still quite a young industry, right? If you look at how long have human beings been constructing buildings, like architecture in the engineer, in the kind of engineering sense, kind of construction sense, we've learned from hundreds of years of doing things wrong and starting to do certain things right. In software engineering, we're still only talking decades, really, right? And the industry evolves all the time, so it's forcing us all to be on a constant learning journey. And if you don't jump on that journey, then you will fall behind to some extent, right? So just always, I guess it's a case of always acknowledging that your skills are never complete. But then that's what makes the whole thing the most fun, right? Is that you're always learning about better ways of solving the problems that you're facing.
Absolutely, and the term lifelong learner really applies to software engineers. And if you want to sort of stay ahead of the curve, it's not like super high pressure, but it's enjoyable to learn about new techniques. And obviously, you'll have plenty of warning if you realize what you're using is getting out of date. Like, for example, like Flash developers back in the day had plenty of warning that it was not going to win the war. But yeah, it's one of those things. And what you said about don't feel like you have to fit everything in a full stack role. I also wanted to really echo that myself as well, because something I see all the time for juniors is self-filtering. Don't self-filter. It's so bad. Like, you see something on a nice to have on a job advert, nice to have Kubernetes, like, just because you've never used it, you don't apply. Like, don't do that. The best thing you can do, even if it's required, you can explain, I haven't used this professionally, but work on some kind of personal project, make something small and show them what you've learned. Is such a good way of displaying your aptitude for it. Like, for one role I did as a junior developer, and I got the job, was I'd never used Angular before, but I made a little like project in Angular as part of the application process. And it was originally the sort of thing where they needed to hire someone who'd used it before, but I was able to get through the process by showing that I was happy to learn. Because when you're a junior developer, there you aren't just hiring for actual programming expertise. You're also hiring for someone's capacity to learn, and you have a great chance to display that. So don't self-filter, because that's how you don't get that first job. Like the worst, like don't spam your CV, and make sure it's a good application. But if it's a good application, the worst someone can say is no and thank you. But I would say absolutely don't filter yourself out, whatever you do.
Yeah, I echo that.
Cool. And in terms of, like, we're talking about juniors now, and what we both did. I mean, if you could have gone back and changed anything about your career, is there anything you would have changed, or are you a believer in don't change anything because you're happy with the outcome?
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like sounding like a pseudo intellectual with the answer I would give to this, but actually, but it would be basically the latter, which is that every decision you make in your life is going to have some, well, with some exceptions, is going to have some positive outcomes and some negative outcomes. And I guess, from my perspective, like I can certainly look at decisions I've made that have had negative outcomes. I did a job. I did one job at a bank, which I won't name, that lasted 3 weeks. And even after one day, I knew I'd made a mistake. I just knew the culture wasn't for me. And so, it was. You could argue that was a negative in many ways. But there's pretty much always a positive to take. And the positive in that situation was that I had learned a lot. Actually, I'd learned a lot about the types of working culture that were likely to be suitable for me. And so I guess, this kind of pseudo intellectual answer would be that every positive has been something that shaped my career in some way. And if I hadn't made any of those decisions, then I would have missed out on the positive things that I've got out of them. So it's very, very difficult for me to justify why I would change anything, because I think every single decision I've made has ultimately led to where I've got to now.
Yeah, I agree. And people often say to me, like, do you regret working recruitment? And I enjoyed doing the internal recruitment and that sort of thing anyway. I probably would have kept on doing that if I wasn't coding. I hated agency recruitment, but do I regret it? Absolutely not. Like, I knew a little bit about coding because I used to play on a computer science football team in uni, because they were short on numbers and some of my mates asked me to play. That was my entire exposure to coding. Then I went and started recruiting software engineers, and I was like, oh, wait a minute, this sounds pretty cool. And this engineer, a couple of engineers I spoke to, who I tried to place into jobs in Berlin, really encouraged me to try and learn, and it set me down this path of learning. And I had a miserable year of my life working in an agency where I didn't enjoy it at all, but I would do that a million times over again to learn about a job that I absolutely love doing now. So if you're stuck in something in a bit of a rut now and you're doing a job you don't enjoy, but you can see a route out, then don't feel regretful that you didn't discover coding when you were 12, because it's kind of whatever. Like, yeah, fine. Some people discovered it early in life, but the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. I'm not sure where that's from. It's probably from like Kung Fu Panda or something, but I still like the phrase. Cool. So I think I might have slightly exceeded the meeting slot that I set up for us. So sorry about that. But it's been really, really great having you on and catching up, Andrew. And I really appreciate it. And I think a lot of junior developers will have got a lot of insight from what you said. Is there anything you want to shout out about Claimer at the moment, either for entrepreneurs that are listening or for developers that might be interested?
Well, firstly, I'd just like to say, thank you for having me on here. I will forgive you for running over. It's been a pleasure to be part of this, and I think it's a great thing you're doing. I really admire what you're giving back. To everyone who's looking to make a career in this industry. So you can easily be forgiven for overrunning.
Thank you.
In terms of shout outs, I mean, I would just say if you're someone who likes interesting technical challenges and you really care about culture, company culture and values, then I'm going to be a big advocate for the idea of coming to work with us at Claimer. And we are hiring at the moment for some engineering roles. So if you are listening to this podcast and you're interested in a new challenge, then I'm sure Cameron will leave some links, to Claimer's vacancy site, so you can check us out and see whether we might fit what it is you're looking for.
So certainly, we'll leave in the description. Beat me to it, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I can edit it out if I am. But Claimer is at least semi-remote now, at the very least, isn't it?
Yeah. So we're operating a hybrid approach now. I mean, that's reality is that's been somewhat dictated by the pandemic. We have hired now fully remote engineers and people in other roles. And that's the way we want to commit to going forward. I mean, for me, the most important thing is that we recognize as a company that everyone has different requirements about, in terms of a working environment to help them get the best out of themselves. So for us, it makes absolute sense to build a company that gives people the option to work in the way that works best for them. So yeah, for sure, like, even if you're not listening from London, that doesn't mean you can't apply to us, basically.
Good stuff. Sounds great. So thank you again so much for your time. And thank you as well, listeners, for tuning in once again. New episodes drop each Monday. You can check us out, thecodercareer.com. I think the website should be corrected and up and running, but I think I've said that last 3 episodes running and it's still not. I've just been really busy, so apologies for that. Get in touch. I'm planning on doing a Q&A episode in a few weeks' time, so submit any questions to thecodercareer@gmail.com, or you can find my LinkedIn in the description. But until next time, this has been Cam Blackwood with Andrew Easter for The Coder Career. See you next time. Thanks again for listening.